We're looking now as we continue on in our studies of the book of Daniel, chapter 12, and we've come down to some very interesting issues as we've looked at the close of probation, and there are many issues obviously discussed in the 12th chapter as I talked about earlier. And one of the things I want to do is I want to go cover a few things, particularly the 1260, 1290, 1335. I want to go over that ground with you now and look at some things. And then in our next, last message, I'm actually going to backtrack a little bit and deal with some other issues. But I wanted to make sure we had time. If you look at here in Daniel chapter 12 in verses 4 and 9, again, this is the sealing of the book of Daniel. And of course, when the time of the end, that very interesting phrase that's used in the 4th verse, and of course in the 9th, you see that the time of the end is 1798. It's not the end of time. The end of time began in 1844, what we call the end of the world. That began in 1844. The time of the end is 1798. Now the way in which you can tell that, well, the way you understand the time of the end, if you go back in Daniel chapter 11, and it begins really in the latter part of verse 31, it continues on in 30, and then continues on in 31. But when the daily shall be taken away, there's talking about in verse 31, and the setting up of the abomination that makes desolate is another phrase or another term used to describe the papacy. So the placing of the setting up of the papacy began in 538. So here we have a specific date now referred to in the latter part of verse 31. And starting from that point all the way to verse 40, if you notice, at the time of the end. So there's that phrase again. So verse 31, at the end of 31 we have 538. And if you read right through these verses, it's talking about the Great Inquisition, the persecution of God's people. And of course, what's interesting is, if you look here with me in verse 35, describing the Inquisition of Daniel, and this is Daniel 11, and some of them, referring to God's people, the saints, understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge them and to make them white. And of course, being the Waldensians and the great reformers, etc. For how long? How long would they be persecuted? Even for or up to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed, meaning at the historical context of the time in which it was given, that's still in the future. So, but at this point, we know that they'll be persecuted up to what time? The time of the end. Well, we know when that period began and we know when it ended. Started in 538, ended in 1798. So the time of the end of Daniel 12, verses 4 and 5 is 1798. Very important that you have to understand that Daniel's book would be sealed and closed up until 1798. Then Daniel's book would be unraveled. And of course, this is the whole point of Revelation chapter 10. The sweet and bitter experience that John has in vision with that little book, a little book of prophecy that was one time closed up, and of course now it's unsealed, and of course this describing the rise of the Millerite movement and the opening of the book of Daniel, which is very fascinating. So Daniel chapter 10 covers from 1798 up to the 1830s, up to the 1843, 44 disappointment. So it's a very interesting period of time. So it's describing the opening of the book of Daniel and the result that would follow from those who would consume the book, referring specifically to the coming of the Lord. They would have a sweet experience in their mouth because there's a beautiful message to proclaim Jesus is coming. But the bitter experience came as a result of their miscalculation in regard to the subject matter of the cleansing of the sanctuary. Of course, if you keep reading Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 to 3, or I think it's 1 to 2, excuse me, there you'll find the answer to the great disappointment. And by the way, this is a footnote. Daniel chapter 10 should not end where it ends in the Bible. The way they broke up the chapters. Man put that there. That's a big mistake. It's a fatal mistake in the 10th chapter of Revelation, because the implication, of course, is that that chapter has ended, meaning the message has come to an end. But that's not the case, because if you look here in Revelation chapter 10, I'll show you. In the latter part, it says, there's the last verses, and he said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many nations, or before many peoples, nations, and tongues, and kings. So, in other words, you must prophesy again, meaning the same message. But he doesn't tell you why there was a bitter experience. In other words, where does the answer lie to the bitterness? Why was there a rejection of this in this bitter experience? And then he said in verse 1 of Daniel of Revelation 11, here's the answer. And there was given unto me a reed like unto a rod. And the angels stood saying, rise. Now notice rise, meaning that he was what? Sitting. He was down. He wasn't sitting. He had a bitter experience. He was disappointed. He's down. Get up. That's what he's saying. Get up. I know you're disappointed. Get up. Rise. And measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without of the temple leave out, and measure it not. So he's telling them, don't measure the court. Measure what? The temple itself. And there's two apartments in the temple, the holy and the most holy. He's telling them to go back and reevaluate the subject matter of the sanctuary, which you got wrong. And understand that your mistake is in reference to this, that the answer to your mistake lies in the sanctuary message. That should be a part of chapter 10, not 11. And so Daniel 12:4 and 9, when he says that Daniel shut up the words and sealed the book even till the time of the end, that's 1798. That's referring to the book of Revelation chapter 10 and verses 1 and 2 in reference to Revelation 11, where the answer to the disappointment lies in the sanctuary. And once they reevaluated and re-examined the sanctuary doctrine, they got the subject matter correct, didn't they? They understood that the cleansing of the sanctuary had nothing to do with the second coming of Jesus directly, but rather it had to do with what? The blotting out of sins. Because they realized that by studying Leviticus 16 and 32 and other scriptures reference to the sanctuary message and the book of Hebrews, they realized that their mistake lied not in the calculation. They got that straightened out. As I told you, they made mistakes. They got the right Jewish calendar. They got that all straightened out prior, but it was in the subject matter. Once they got that all put together, then what happened? Then they began to preach the three angels' message in its fullness. And so that's what he's talking about here. So 1798, and then of course what's interesting, knowledge shall increase, men shall run to and fro, right? Men shall run to and fro. Now the actual context of this is in reference to the book of Daniel, what would happen when when the book of Daniel would be unsealed. Knowledge would increase, meaning from the book of Daniel. And again, that goes back to Revelation 10. That's the whole point. And so you're dovetailing this right into that portion of the scriptures. And then it says, many shall run to and fro, knowledge shall increase. Now, this does have a direct correlation as well with the science. Knowledge would increase, and in that sense that scientific discoveries, we went from walking to riding horses and buggies and then trains and then planes and automobiles and so things began to change how transportation would be brought about, and and it has made us a world community. Transportation has broken down barriers, national barriers, in the sense that in the 18th century, if you wanted to travel from Europe to the United States or North America, it'd take you 3 to 4 months to get here. And most people, even before the 1950s, but most people never traveled outside their counties. They born there, lived there, raised there, died there. They never went outside their counties. Once the superhighways were put in because of Eisenhower, well, the reason that was put in is because during World War II in Europe, they had the same road structure they had for centuries. They never cobbled, the only things that were cobblestone were cities or towns. But the main roads were all mud and dirt, and that's all it was. He came back after World War II and said, we need to straighten this out. America's the same way. And that's when they put in superhighways. That's what they were doing after the war, or during the war, even in Europe. They were trying to figure out how to better roads so they can travel their troops quicker. And I'm all for easier, quicker transportation, but I don't know, some things that seem to appear to be good may not be really good for you culturally. I'm not interested in absorbing other cultures, to be honest with you. I'm an American. I like my culture. And I don't really care about Europe's culture, and I don't care about Asia's culture, and I don't care about Africa's culture, and I don't care about Saudi Arabia's culture. They can keep it. I don't care for it. Trust me, I've been in those places. You don't want to live there. There's a lot of crazy things that go on in a lot of those countries and continents, and especially if it's an Islamic country, you have basically no freedoms. And so I'm not a multicultural kind of guy. And yes, I'm politically incorrect, and I'm not political in the sense that I belong to a political party. But knowledge would increase. Men would run to and fro. Let's say primarily the application has to do with the book of Daniel. But the secondary application, no doubt, has to do with scientific knowledge. That would increase, there's no doubt. Things would be made much easier on some levels. And so this is what you're dealing with here. And of course, I've got a little footnote here, time to the end. You can look at a very interesting passage in Desire of Ages, page 234, very controversy 356 and 360. There's some very interesting things there. And as I talked about a little earlier, verses 5 to 13, if you keep going through Daniel chapter 12, 5 to 13 is the epilogue. And of course, if you'll notice with me, I just want to now, this is a breakdown of 5 to 13. If you go to verses 5 and 6, verse 5 says, "And then I, Daniel, looked and beheld, there stood other two, one on the one side of the bank of the river and the other on the other side of the bank of the river." So here's Daniel now. He's basically, the vision is over. He's been told, seal it up, close it up till the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, knowledge will increase. So Daniel's now still looking. He's still in vision. But this is really secondary in the sense of what's been told. This is just kind of an additional stuff added, but it's secondary, not primary, to the vision that was given in Daniel 11 in that sense. But it does dovetail in some aspects. And then he says, and one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, "How long shall it be to the end of these wonders?" Okay, again, that's the great question. So you got two angels standing one side of the river and the other side, and one says to the other one, "How long is it going to be to the end of these rivers?" Now Daniel's observing this. He's watching this. He's not participating. He's watching. He's observing. And to the end of these wonders. Now what's interesting, he's asking how long. How long has to do with what? Time. Now he just said in verse 4, seal it up, close up the book, till the time of the end. Then at that time, many shall run to and fro, knowledge shall be increased. Then he says, I saw two men standing there at the end of the rivers, one on one side, the other, and the other guy asking God, how long is the end? It's going to be to the end of these wonders. And the end of the wonders, that subject matter that is referred to, refers to what was just revealed, or what was at least expressed and told to Daniel. Now remember, how long? Time. Now if you follow that through, what happens? What does he talk about? The 1260, 1290, 1335. But the primary subject of these wonders has to do with the next, and that you'll find in verse 7. And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, and held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that lives forever and ever, that it shall be for time, times and a half. And when he shall have accomplished the scattering of the people of the holy, or the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So he just asked, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And what does he do? He gives you the answer in verse 7. And what is it going to be? The 1260, time, times and a half the time, 40 and 2 months, times dividing of times, 1260 days. These are all different ways of describing the same time period. And this, of course, being the 1260. And, of course, that time period starts in 538, Justinian's decree, and ends in 1798. Now, Justinian's decree, now, one thing I want to say about backing up just a little bit about this. Remember, when we're talking about the 1260, that's not the beginning of the papacy. The Catholic Church existed centuries before this. What we're talking about is when she will receive power. When she is set up as the Bible says, or Daniel says, diverse power. And that, of course, being a religio-political power. Remember, prior to 538, she had always been striving for quite some time for political power, but she could never really obtain it the way in which she truly desired. Prior to that, she was a powerful church, but not a powerful state. And remember, the papacy only receives its power from the state. If it doesn't have political power, it has no power. That, of course, you can find in Revelation chapter 13, there in verse 2. Remember, the dragon, or verse 3, the dragon gave his power, seat, and great authority. Who gave this great authority? Well, we know primarily it's Satan behind the scene. But remember, the dragon there, big was so representing who? Pagan Rome. So the state gives the papacy its power. And so in 538, Justinian issues a decree, goes into effect, well, actually went into effect in 538, it was issued in 533. But eventually it went into effect, and there you have Justinian's decree, the unification of church and state, meaning that Justinian would, in the east, in the west, yes, in the east, I apologize, it is in the east. He would then establish papal supremacy. From that point forward, that's when you begin calculating the 1260. And so you have papal supremacy, and it lasts for 1206 years, all the way to 1798. And of course, what happens in 1798? You go over to Revelation. What do we find in Revelation chapter 13? There in verse 10, he that leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He that's killed with the sword shall be killed with the sword. Right? You go over, of course, in verse 3, I saw one of his heads that were wounded to death. So what happened in 1798? Now think about it. What began in 538? The unification of church and state. What happened in 1798? The ending of church and state. In other words, what began in 538 came to an end in 1798. Did the papacy come to an end in 1798? No. What was the death blow? What was it called? It was a severe wound. Why? Because the state was taken away from the church. She no longer could exercise her power to the extent that she did prior. This is why it was a deadly wound. But the Bible says the deadly wound will be healed. And when will it be healed? When the image of the beast is formed. The image of the beast is not Sunday law. The image of the beast is the reunification of church and state. Okay? When you start to see the church and the state unifying, coming together more and more, you're seeing the image of the beast being healed. You understand? It's being formed. And when that happens, then you're going to see a reunification. And then they're going to push for a Sunday law. Now remember, you got to understand something. Prior to the reunification of church and state, the deadly wound being healed, prior to that, they want to push for a Sunday law. They want Sunday laws, but they know they can't get them. So what do they got to do? That's when they bring church and state together. And then here come the Sunday laws. And as I say, I really believe, politically speaking, I really believe all the elements are here. I really do. I can see this president doing it. I'm not saying he will. I'm not a prophet in that regard. But I tell you what, I can see him signing a Sunday law. I could see him doing that absolutely without a blink of an eye. And I'm going to tell you why I say that. Because he already assigned a prayer of a day of Thanksgiving and prayer. You remember that, I don't know, about a couple of months ago. But he made sure it was on a Sunday. In other words, the declaration was to be made for a Sunday. And you go back now, that's true, other presidents have made declarations of prayer and thanksgiving, but theirs were done on a Wednesday or Tuesday or other days of the week. In other words, it wasn't specifically designed for a Sunday to make sure that it had to fall on that day. And I think what you're seeing is a crack in the wall. And so it's just something to think about. Just something to share with you. Don't be naive, dear friends. Now look, there are a lot of things he's saying is true. This country is heading in the wrong direction. We need to stop this illegal immigration. It has gone mad. And by the way, you must realize that the Vatican is behind the illegal immigration. If you can't figure that out, you're just have no clue about history. What's happening is, if you notice, if you follow this issue, it's not just the United States, all over Europe, but mainly it's addressing the Anglo-European heritage races. Why? Because we have a tradition of Christianity being the basis of our civilization. Not the African continent, not Asia. You understand? They weren't built on Christianity. You understand? Western civilization was built on Christianity. Protestant Christianity was introduced. When that came to pass, that became the driving force of missions. And that's why you found God's people going all over the world. Protestantism was what pushed them. It's what drove them into that realm. And what you're having is a systematic dismantling of the Anglo-European Protestant traditions. Remember, the United States of America was established as a Protestant republic. You understand that? I mean, all the institutions, the school systems, the judicial system, all the institutions of America were built on Protestant principles. Not anymore now. I mean, our public school system is to say it's a disaster, that'd be too kind. And just to show you, in terms of Protestantism, how dead it is in this country, I mean, there's not one member of the Supreme Court that's a Protestant. Most members of Congress are either Roman Catholic or they're pro-Zionists. And you have, look, we could go down the list of things, but dear friends, there's no doubt that this country is on a death spiral. And there are some who actually believe it's going to recover. Now, you may have a slight upsurge. But what people don't understand in this country, and sadly to say even some Christians don't understand, that the Bible makes it very clear what America is going to do. And you can't be naive about those things. And what you're witnessing is the death of a nation. And everything that's being committed today by us as a people, as a nation, whether it be social issues, whether it be political issues, economic, we can go down the list. It spells disaster. It spells it's the end. As I say, you may have an uptick. There may be some surge coming a little bit up, but it's not going to. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a massive laceration on the body. It's not going to heal it. And it's not going to solve the problem. And so because of that, obviously the economic woes, the political, social woes that are taking place, there's an element within America known as apostate Protestantism. They will reach their hands across the Gulf, clasp the hands of the Roman power, and they will then do everything they can in their power to bring forth what they think will solve the problems, and that is the Sunday law. We need to get back to God. And I agree with that fundamental premise. Yes, we need God. but not through legislative means. No one will ever accept Jesus through legislative means. As Thomas Jefferson said, it's only made men hypocrites. In other words, when you try to legislate making people Christian, you make people, in the end, you make people hypocrites on the issue. And so, and when we deal with the issue of the separation of church and state, you got to remember, dear friends, neither the founders believed nor did they teach the idea that the secular humanist concept of the separation of church and state is that God must be taken out of government. That's not true. Look, what you have to understand and explain is this: that when it comes to the separation of church and state, the founding fathers, Roger Williams, you can read his writings, he's beautiful on this and describing this concept. But the separation of church and state takes place in relation to the Ten Commandments. And remember, the Ten Commandments were specifically designed to be put on 2 tables of stone. There's a reason why God did that. The first 4 have to do with your relationship with the Almighty God, not with you and me. The first 4 commandments have nothing to do with me in relation to you. Nothing whatsoever. It has to do with me and God, and that's it. You understand? And so, in other words, the first 4 commandments have a direction that goes directly upward. You and me, right? Or you and God, up and down. Now, the last 6 commandments put on the second table commandments is the social commandments that have to do with you and me. Now, the direct relation to God, all of them, there's no doubt about it. But they're social commandments. Don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery, don't murder, right? Don't covet your neighbor's goods, and don't honor your mother and your father. Those are social commandments. So the separation between the church and state has to do, let's say this is the first 4 commandments, my right hand, and the other one is the last 6, is the separation is between the first 4. There's where the wall of separation goes. You understand? Meaning that the state has nothing to do with the first 4 commandments. It's not their business. It has none of the. Now, the last 6, yes. They have a direct correlation to government to do with the last 6 commandments. And because it's about keeping society safe. It's about the social compact we have with one another when we form ourselves into a society. If you lived all alone in the island, and sometimes, sometimes you just wish after, you see things that are taking place and say, God, put me on, I don't care. Just put me on an island. All my business, let me have my books. Make sure there's a coconut and a banana, bushes around. And I'll drink a coconut and bananas till you come. And, but if you lived on an island by yourself, then the last 6 commandments, really have no real purpose, in the sense that, because if I wanted to take that coconut, so what? I take it. I'm the only one on the island. It's mine. It's not yours. It doesn't belong to anybody. I'll take it. I'm not stealing. And so forth. So you can see that it doesn't make no sense. But once you have another person, all it takes is 2 people to form a society. Now, once you do that, you've got to form some rules and regulations in order to coexist, because you want to coexist in the most peaceful manner that you can. But what you have to understand is that when you do that, you do 2 things immediately. When you form a society, you give up certain things, and you accept certain things. You embrace certain things. For example, like I say, if you're all alone, you can do whatever you want. You can say whatever you want. I can yell, scream, anything, and there's no liability, right? But the moment you form a society, you can't say whatever you want. We believe in freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean you have freedom of unlimited speech. That's not what that means. For example, you just can't go around slandering people's character. You're going to get sued. You can be liable for that, and that can cause damages to someone's reputation or business. That means you're held accountable. Well, that means prior to the compact, you could do whatever you want. You could say whatever you want. But once you form a society, you can't say whatever you want to say. So you have to give up certain rights. But you're giving up certain rights for the benefit of the overall good, so that both can coexist in happiness and peace. Now, that are the social issues, but you never ever, when you form a society, please listen, never give up your first 4 commandments. You understand? That has nothing to do with you and I in terms of our social compact. That's between God and me. It's not you and me. So the last 6 commandments have a direct correlation to the government in terms of a social compact with society. It must uphold those last 6 commandments. It must. It's a God-given mandate if you want a good society. And the first 4 commandments, and let me explain this in terms of how to make the last 6 really work. It's when you apply the first 4 in your life that you can really truly keep the last 6. Then you won't steal, you won't lie, you won't cheat, and so forth and so on and so on. And so that's what makes a good society. But in order to have a good society, it really relegates itself to having a happy family, a good family life. Because remember, what is society in a public format? It's simply the extension of the family. Meaning what? Society in a public format is the family exposed openly. You understand? When you go outside your house, you're a part of the public society. When you're in your house, that's a private society. It's your family. It's a unit that only exists within in that capacity. But when we go out in public, we are now what? Revealing what's really going on privately in our homes. So when people behave in a manner that's absolutely inappropriate publicly, it says something about them privately. You understand? When people use vulgarity in public, it says something about what's going on privately in their home. Do you understand? When people behave in an inappropriate way publicly, it's an extension of what's happening privately. And so that's why the family unit is the soul of society. You break up the family unit, you don't have a society anymore. You will eventually run into anarchy. And that's where we are at now in society. I mean, the idea that, let's tear down the monuments as if tearing down a monument is going to solve your problems. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous. And then here's the issue. I always say to people, where does it end? Now think about it. Where does it end? And to what degree, then, shall we go with tearing down monuments? Listen to what I mean now. Today, let's say, for the sake of the argument, that these people who want to tear down the monuments, let's say they're in charge. So they tear down the monuments. Let's say 50 years from now, 100 years from now, this tide has turned and the other people are now in charge. Now they put up all the old monuments that were torn down 100 years ago, and they tear down the other monuments that they kept up that were stayed 100 years ago. Now you got a reversal. So every time society shifts and changes, you keep moving, you keep shifting, you keep deciding. That's not the way you run a society. You can't do it that way. And besides, the fundamental premise of these issues, you got to understand, dear friends, is that no society has ever been perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect society. Every social compact has ended in disaster. The children of Israel were given the greatest constitution in the history of mankind. God dictated it to Moses. Word for word. Moses, write this down. Yes, sir. Boom. And he wrote down the greatest constitution ever given to the human race. And God's people absolutely came to pieces. Now think about this. They were under patriarchal rulership, right? From the time of Abraham, and you go down to the patriarchs, and you come to Moses. Finally, one day they cry and complain and boo-hoo. We want a king like everyone else. And then Samuel and all the judges and we don't need anybody. We don't need anyone. Don't go down that path. That's going to be dangerous. We don't want to be like the world. But God, if you persist long enough, God will give you what you want. Even though He knows it may not be good for you, He's going to step back and say, okay, you want it? Fine. You're going to have it. And so finally they cry out, we want a king. So here comes Saul. God picks a righteous man, and he was a godly. Apparently from all description prior to him becoming king, this was one godly, humble man. But that poor man lost his soul because of the sins of others. Let me explain. He's guilty for what he did, no doubt. And it doesn't excuse his choices he made. But had they never cried out for the sin of a king, he would have never been chosen, and he may never have lost his soul. See, sometimes the choices of things that you want in life, you don't realize the impact it has on somebody else. You may be damning somebody else straight to hell.
That's right.
All because of what you want. And so here comes Saul. So Saul is king for 40 years. Then comes David, 40 years. Then Solomon, 40 years, right? So you've got these great kings, or two of the great kings, although all three are seriously flawed. And then you've got Rehoboam and Jeroboam for a period of time, then Jeroboam, and then you have a division of the kingdom, and the thing just seems to deteriorate. It just goes from bad to worse. And yet they were given the greatest constitution on the face of the earth. Now, the Constitution of the United States is a great document, no doubt about it. It's not a perfect document, far from it. But what makes the document so great is its ability to be flexible in future generations in order to rectify previous wrongs. And this is the whole point I make about the monument. Yes, dear friends, listen. I'm not here to suggest that this country was perfect. Far from it, as I said. And slavery should have never existed in this country. Unfortunately, sad to say, it did. And it's a serious flaw in our nation's history, in our past. But the thing we've got to remember is this, dear friends. You can't erase the past and think by simply ignoring or pushing it aside, somehow you'll make a better society. But I'm trying to help you to realize, dear friends, that in order for us to learn, to have a better society in the future, we can only do that when we understand what in the world went on in the past. As we learn these lessons from the past, we pray to the good Lord we won't repeat them in the future. We won't make the blundering mistakes. And so what's happening in the United States is a dismantling. And by the way, let me just help you to understand, the monuments really aren't the real issue. Let's keep it straight here. That's not the real issue. It's the absolute division or dividing of society. Remember, what's rather fascinating, if you study the history of the American Revolution, everyone had to pull together, old and young, the disabled and the able, and so forth. You go down, men and women. Everybody pitched in to help out with the American Revolution. It's the only way they could win. And even though the odds were greatly against us as a nation or as a people back then, with God's help and everyone coming together, unifying, they could accomplish miracles. And so one of the keys to the success of the powers that be is to divide the country, keep you segregated in so many ways. And unfortunately, that's what we're having, a dismantling. 1798, the image of the beast comes, and finally it's healed. The United States of America will form it. There's no doubt about it. And I say I see all the elements right now. Where let's put, like making a recipe. You put a little bit of this, a little of that, a little of that. You're going to end up with a bowl of soup or whatever you're trying to make. And I see all the elements coming together. Everything's coming together. You can't keep going in society like the way we're going. Impossible. We can't keep going. Something's going to implode somewhere at some point in time. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. Again, we're not told all the little details. We've got to wait, Sister White says. Sometimes you've got to wait for things to come to pass, look back, and then realize, okay, then that's where that fits or understanding comes to pass. But there's a lot of things on the horizon. For example, we don't know what's going to happen between North Korea and the United States. No idea. Is it possible you could have some catastrophic event? Yeah, that's possible. I'm not saying it's going to be, but it's possible. In other words, what I'm saying, you see all the elements, all these things, social unrest, as I mentioned to you. So it's possible. So the 1260 has to do with when. How long shall it be to the end of these wonders? He's telling you once again, well, he's now giving you a specific time period, once again, reaffirming what? The time of the end. When it will be, the end of these things? 1798. And so you have the 1260. So the 1260 specifically addressed here now. It's a little different when you look at the 1260 in Daniel 7. What's the purpose of Daniel 7, 1260? Well, go with me to Daniel 7. Daniel 7. I'm going to show you something. Daniel 7, and go to verse 25. Daniel 7, 25. Show you the difference, the way the time prophecy is used, and Daniel versus the Daniel 11 and Daniel 7. And he shall speak great, what's of course being the little horn here now. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints in the Most High, and shall think to change times of law. And they, meaning God's people, shall be given into his hands, of course being the papacy, until times and the dividing of time. So how, now that's the same time period, but notice how it's being employed. Notice how the application works in reference to what? What's he talking about here? So it has to do with the length of the persecution of God's people, doesn't it? Where when you go to Daniel chapter 12, he's not talking about the length of the time of the persecution. How long shall be the end of these wonders? Meaning reference to the prophecies that were given in Daniel. Now it's come to a close. Verse 4 says, seal it up till the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, knowledge shall be increased. Then Daniel introduces this subject to two angels standing on the side. One asks one, how long is it going to be to the end of these things? Times, and dividing of times, or high times, and half a time. So he tells them now this has nothing to do specifically addressing the period of the persecution, but rather in context of the time of the end, when the book of Daniel shall be unsealed. Then all these things will come to pass. In other words, all the things will be revealed and start to be understood. Now let's keep going on. Let's see. We're going to have to close up pretty soon. But let me go on. Let me go on a little bit further here, because I do want to deal with the we're getting kind of close. I don't want to cut it short. Okay, I'll tell you what. Look at verse 8 and 9. Let's get to this here. And I heard, but I understood not. Now, Daniel heard the conversation. Remember, he's not in the conversation. He's an observer. So he said, I heard it, but notice what he said. I understood it not. So they just gave, remember, sees two angels, right? Two beings standing, talking to each other, asking a question. How long? Right? How long? He gives the answer. The answer is to 1260. Then he said, Daniel said, I heard it. I just don't understand it. All right, now. So what do you think is going to happen? It's going to be a reaffirming. Now watch. Then I said, O Lord, what shall be the end of these things? He's asking the same question that was asked prior in verse 6. I heard it. I don't understand it. Now Daniel's frustrated, as you can see. It's clearly in the way he's asking that question. Lord, Lord, what shall be the end of these things? Now look at verse 9. God's going to give him the answer that he gave him before. You think there's a different answer? You know, 2 plus 2, your math teacher said 2 plus 2 equals 4. I don't understand, Mrs. Johnson. 2 plus 2 equals 4. She's not going to give you a different, a different answer. It's the only one answer, 4. Now she made a different equation. 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals the same thing. And so this is what God is doing. Now look at verse 9. And he said, go thy way, Daniel, or Gabriel, really, this is Gabriel speaking, for the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall be purified. Meaning, in the meantime, Daniel, many are going to be purified and made white and tried. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So he's repeating the essence of what he just said. Just did it in a little slightly different way, but he's repeating the same thing. Daniel, seal it up, close it up until the time of the end. Daniel wanted to know the mysteries of what he had just seen. But what did God say? It's not for you, Daniel. It's not for you. Close it up, seal it till the time of the end. That's when then many will run to and fro. Knowledge shall be increased. The 1260 has to do specifically with that issue in regard to when the book would be opened. But also too, and I want to show you something as another way of reaffirming it, And he says in verse 11, and from the time that the daily, now notice there's another way of describing it, watch this, the daily, by the way, the word sacrifice is applied by man's wisdom, doesn't belong there to the text. You can take a pen, you can scratch it out, eraser, I don't care what you do. That word does not belong in that Bible. Because it's, notice, italicized, meaning it's not in the original Hebrew. It doesn't belong there. Man put it there because the word daily itself is just an adjective. There's no subject matter. In other words, it's not a noun. You put sacrifice to it, now you have a subject matter. Now it's a noun. So you need to know what does the daily represent. But if you go back and understand it early on in previous portions of Scripture, you find that the daily is referring to the daily abomination, not the daily sacrifice. See, the translators thought that the word daily here referred to the sanctuary message. But it doesn't. It has nothing to do with the temple of God, the sanctuary. Nothing. The daily is dealing with the daily abomination, or as what is known as the daily paganism. And from that time that the daily shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up. Now remember, there's that phrase again I told you back in verse 31. Place of the abomination that makes desolate. Who's that? That's the papacy. And so you find that the papacy, so the time from the daily is taken away, they'll be set, then eventually what will follow after, the setting up of the papacy, that should be 1,290 days. So there's the 1290. Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1335. But go your way, Daniel, till the NB. But thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. Daniel, go your way, live your life. All these things will come to pass, but unfortunately it's not going to be in your day. You are going to live your life. You will. He says, then you shall rest. You will die. You're going to die, Daniel. And he says, but at the end, it says you'll stand in your lot at the end of the days. Meaning God says, Daniel, you are going to be saved. You will be in the kingdom of heaven. Now, and what's interesting is both the 1290, 1335 have a direct correlation with the here's the 1290. This is the 1290 in verse 11. Notice with me here, we're going to close with the 1290, 1335. He says this, the 1290 begins from the time that the daily desolation is taken away. Of course, that began in 508 by Clovis when he removed the last pagan power that was hindering the papacy. 508, counting down 1290 years, we arrived at what year? 1798. So the 1290 is given specifically again what's in reference to the book of Daniel. 1290 ends the same time as the 1260. They both end at the same time. They don't begin at the same time. There's a 30-year gap. The 1290 begins in 508. The 1260 begins in 538. Remember, the time from the daily is taken away. They'll set up the abomination that makes desolate. How long did it take? 30 years. 508, Justinian in the east. Clovis in the west. Justinian in the east. 508, 538. A 30-year span of time from the time of the Clovis taking away the paganism to the setting up of the papacy. Then you end in 1798. Both 1260, 1290. All right? And that's what that's referring to there. Again, the 1290, 508. To 1798. Paganism taken away. That's what the daily is, dear friends. Please don't let people hoodwink you. Now we come to the 1335. Now if you notice the 1335, we don't have a starting point. What we do have is an ending. But we don't have a beginning. So context is the only way in which you can understand when the 1335 begins. Now, unlike the 1290 and the 1260, they both end at the same time. The 1290 and 1335 do not end at the same time, but they both begin at the same time. Both the 1290 and the 1335 begin from the time that the daily was taken away. That is 508. Counting down 508, 1335, you come to what year? 1843. Not 44, 43. Why is this so important? Revelation chapter 10. What happened? The book of Daniel was unsealed. He ate the book of Daniel, the message from the book of Daniel. It was sweet in the mouth. You have a great disappointment. When did it begin? 1843. Continued on to 44. He then says, get up, rise, measure the temple. Your answer is in the sanctuary message, in the sanctuary, it's in the temple. When you solve that, you will solve your message, and then you must prophesy now again.
Amen.
You see? So 1843 takes you all the way to the first and second disappointment. There's the Millerite Advent movement, Revelation 10. So that's the 1335. But then he goes on to say, Daniel has to stand on his lot at the end of the days. I want you to take these statements down. I'll read them to you. This is first coming from Prophets and Kings, page 547. Sister White says this. Listen to this. Daniel's wonderful prophecies as recorded by him in chapter 7 to 12 of the book bearing his name were not fully understood even by the prophet himself. But before his life labors closed, he was given the blessed assurance that at the end of the days, in the closing period of this world's history, he would again be permitted to stand in his lot in his place. Meaning through the book. Daniel once again stands, dear friends, in the book of Daniel by being unsealed. It was not given to him to understand all that God had revealed to him in divine purpose. Shut up the words and seal the book. He was directed concerning his prophetic writings. These were to be sealed even to the time of the end. Go thy way, Daniel. The angel once more directed the faithful messenger of Jehovah. For the words are closed up and sealed even to the time of the end. Thou shalt, and go thou thy way to the end be. But thou shalt rest and stand on the lot at the end of the days. So one of the very interesting applications says at the end of the days you'll stand in your lot has to do referencing to the book of Daniel. That once it's unsealed at the end of those days, meaning the 1290 and 1798, Daniel, the book of Daniel, would stand in his lot. Once again, people would be reading about Daniel. And his life would come back again as if he had been resurrected. And we're still talking about Daniel to this very day. Now look at this other statement. Testimony of the Ministers, page 114, 115. Now this is a different application of the standing in the lot at the end of the days. Listen to this. Twice Daniel inquired, how long shall it be to the end of time? It was the Lion of the tribe of Judah who unsealed the book and gave to John the revelation of what should be in the last days. Daniel stood in his lot to bear his testimony, which was sealed until the time of the end. Notice now, when would Daniel stand in his lot again? When the first angel's message should be proclaimed to the world. When was that? 1843, the 1335. So both the 1290 and 1335 specifically referencing to the time of the end, or the time when Daniel was standing in his lot. What's interesting though, at the great disappointment of 1843, then you come to 44, and they straighten it out, they finally get it proclaimed. Remember, the judgment begins with who? The dead. Right? Meaning that when Daniel was standing in his lot at the end of those times, meaning at some point in time, Daniel would have to be investigated. At some point in time. But God reassures him, you will stand in your lot. You will be accounted righteous. So this is really the end of the thing. And this, of course, being the description of the 1260, 1290, 1335. And that's exactly how those time prophecies should be understood. All right? And so you have very, very interesting. It's just fascinating to look at these things. So, look, we come to an end of Daniel, the 12th chapter. In our next message, what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up, just dial back just a little bit. We're going to still talk about something in Daniel 12, but we're going to talk about the final deliverance of God's people.